Welcome, my friends, to another journey through time here on our channel. Tonight, we step into a world where survival was not about convenience, but about sheer determination. A world where the nights were longer than most of us can imagine, where the cold was not just discomfort, but a force of nature that could decide who lived and who did not. This is the story of how the Vikings, those hardy seafarers of the north, survived the coldest nights of the year without the comforts of heat as we know it today. Before we dive into their longhouses, their furs, their fires, and their ingenuity, let me gently remind you that if you enjoy these historical journeys, consider subscribing and liking this video. It helps us keep traveling back through time together. Share where you are listening from and the time of night, because there is something beautiful in knowing that across countries and time zones, we are all connected through these stories. Now imagine with me. The sky is dark, the sea is silent, and the stars stretch across the heavens like frozen sparks. It is midwinter in Scandinavia. The sun has dipped so low that daylight itself feels like a visitor who no longer stays for long. The wind whistles through the fjords, rattling against wooden planks, seeping into every gap of a home built to resist the northern elements. Outside, the snow lies deep, pressed into drifts that swallow footsteps and silent sound. Inside, families gather, wrapped in wool, fur, and the closeness of one another, preparing for a night that will test both body and spirit. The Vikings lived in one of the harshest climates in Europe. Long winters, brutal storms, and nights that seemed endless demanded resilience. They did not have central heating, no radiators, no flick of a switch to make a room warm. Fire was both friend and danger. They knew the value of a flame, but also the risks it carried. Smoke, sparks, and the possibility of a home reduced to ashes. And so, their survival depended not only on fire, but on clever construction, clothing, bedding, animals, rituals, and the strength of community. Let us begin with their homes, the longhouses, for these were more than buildings. They were fortresses against the cold, centers of life where families, servants, livestock, and at times even visitors shared the same walls. A Viking longhouse could stretch over 20 meters in length, its frame of timber covered with planks, turf, or wattle and daub. The roof was steep, often thatched, and the walls thick, sometimes layered with earth or sod to keep out the biting wind. Inside, the layout was practical. A central hearth ran along the middle of the floor, where fire could burn and smoke would slowly drift upward, seeping through a hole in the roof. This fire was not kept blazing all night. Wood was precious, gathering it was labor, and too much flame meant danger. At night, the fire might be reduced to embers, enough to glow faintly and provide some warmth, but far from the steady heat we imagine. The smoke itself was an ally. While unpleasant to modern lungs, it insulated the home, filling gaps and slowing the escape of warmth. It clung to rafters, darkened beams, and hung like a protective veil. Over time, the very smell of smoke was the smell of survival. The hearth was sacred, both practical and spiritual. It was a place where meals were cooked, stories told, and gods invoked. And yet, once the flames dimmed, it was the structure of the longhouse and the strategies of its people that kept the night bearable. Now, picture a Viking family preparing for sleep. The bed was not a mattress as we know it. For many, it was a wooden frame filled with straw, layered with animal skins, woolen blankets, and perhaps feather stuffing if fortune allowed. Straw was cheap, plentiful, and insulating, though it also hosted insects, lice, and mice. Over the straw came layers of fur, sheepskin, reindeer, or bearskin for those who had hunted well. These furs were not luxuries, but necessities, trapping heat and holding it close to the body. And here we come to one of the most surprising aspects of Viking survival. They slept together. Entire families, sometimes with servants or guests, shared the same sleeping area. Privacy was not the expectation, warmth was. A dozen bodies together generated heat far greater than one alone. Children nestled between parents, elders tumped into corners, and perhaps a dog curled at their feet. This closeness was not just affection, but strategy. In those hours of deep cold, a human body was as valuable as any blanket. Animals, too, played their part. In poorer households, or during the harshest nights, livestock might be brought inside. Goats, sheep, or even a cow could be tethered in a corner of the longhouse. Their breath, their body heat, their sheer presence added degrees of warmth to the air. It may sound unpleasant to modern ears, but to the Viking farmer, it was life preserved. The snorting of a pig or the soft shuffle of sheep hooves was a reminder that the night was survivable, that the warmth of beasts could mean the difference between frostbite and waking whole in the morning. Clothing did not end with the day. Vikings often slept in the same garments they wore to work. Wool was their ally, spun thick, woven tight, and layered for insulation. Wool retained warmth even when damp, a critical advantage in a land where snow melted into boots and cloaks daily. Over tunics and trousers came cloaks pinned with brooches, and at night these cloaks doubled as blankets. Some even wore caps to bed, not unlike the nightcaps of later medieval Europe, for the head loses heat quickly and must be covered. We might imagine them huddled under layers, a small boy pulling a sheepskin over his shoulders, a mother adjusting her daughter's woolen cap, a father making sure the last ember in the hearth glows safely. The smell of smoke mingles with animal fur, the air heavy and still. Outside, the snow falls silently, and the world is dark. But inside the longhouse, warmth is found in togetherness, in shared breath and shared blankets. Yet physical warmth was not their only defense. The Vikings carried with them rituals and beliefs that gave comfort through the night. Sleep was not merely rest. It was a vulnerable state, a time when the soul might wander, when dreams carried messages from gods or spirits. Before closing their eyes, many spoke prayers to household gods, ancestors, or to Odin, seeking protection until dawn. To the Viking mind, the night was filled with dangers seen and unseen. A whispered prayer, a charm tucked under a pillow, or a story told by the fire gave courage against the chill of both body and spirit. And stories, these were blankets of the mind. As families lay close together, elders spoke of heroes, of voyages, of gods who battled frost giants in realms colder still. These tales were more than entertainment. They were lessons in endurance, reminders that even the harshest cold was part of a larger order. If Thor could wield his hammer against the giants of ice, then surely a family could withstand the bite of another winter night. This blend of practical and spiritual survival created resilience. The Vikings were not simply enduring the cold. They were shaping themselves against it, weaving it into their identity. To live in Scandinavia was to accept that winter was a ruler as powerful as any king. It demanded respect, caution, and ingenuity. And so every night spent in a longhouse, under layers of fur, beside kin and cattle, was a small victory against that ruler. As you listen now, perhaps from a warm bed with modern comforts around you, consider the quiet strength it took to close one's eyes in such a world. To sleep not with the assurance of central heating, but with the trust in family, in animals, in wool, in the slow warmth of embers, and in the stories that promised the gods themselves understood the struggle. This was how the Vikings survived their coldest nights, not with heat as we think of it, but with the warmth of life lived together, layer upon layer, soul beside soul, until morning light returned.
As the night deepens, let us step even closer into the longhouse, into the routines and habits that made the cold survivable for those who called themselves Vikings. If the walls could speak, they would tell stories not only of battles fought on distant seas, but of countless ordinary nights endured at home, when the enemy was not a rival clan or a foreign king, but the relentless cold creeping under the door. Inside these homes, every detail mattered.
The benches along the walls doubled as beds, with straw and skins piled upon them. Above the benches, niches in the walls might hold personal belongings, wooden chests storing not only clothing but precious keepsakes, beads, or tools. At night, these benches became the core of survival, shared by families who measured their strength not in gold or swords, but in how well they could endure the dark months together. For children, the experience of winter nights was both frightening and formative. Imagine a boy of 10 years lying beside his parents and siblings, hearing the moan of the wind outside, feeling the house tremble slightly as gusts pressed against the timbers. His breath forms little clouds in the air before it warms into the layers of fur. He listens to his grandmother's voice, weaving a tale of gods and monsters. And though the story is meant to comfort, it also reminds him that the world is vast, cold, and filled with forces beyond his control. In this way, the cold itself became a teacher, instilling humility and resilience in each new generation. The animals, too, were part of this nightly rhythm. Sheep and goats, settled near the far end of the hall, shuffled and sighed, their warmth rising invisibly to mingle with the air of the house. Dogs, ever loyal, curled against their owners, paws twitching in dreams. Horses might be stabled just outside, but their presence was close enough to be felt. These creatures were not just property, they were partners in survival, their warmth as essential as their labor. To sleep among animals was not degradation, but recognition of a shared battle against the elements. And then there was the matter of clothing. For in Viking lands, what one wore to bed could decide how one woke up. Wool was the miracle fabric of the north. Spun from the hardy sheep of Scandinavia, it held heat even when damp, and could be woven into everything from undergarments to cloaks. Layer upon layer, a Viking might wear a linen undertunic, a woolen overtunic, trousers, leg wrappings, and finally a cloak clasped with a brooch. At night, these layers were rarely shed. Cloaks became blankets, tunics became nightshirts, and caps shielded heads from the loss of precious warmth. Some archaeological finds even suggest that bedding was lined with feathers for those who could afford it. Down from geese or eider ducks provided luxurious insulation, though such materials were not common in every household. Still, where possible, Vikings sought softness not out of vanity, but because softness meant survival. The comfort of feathers was the comfort of not shivering, the promise of waking with energy to face another day of work. But survival was not merely a matter of physics. The Vikings understood the mind was as fragile as the body in the face of winter. And so, rituals before sleep were crucial. Families might gather around the last glow of the fire to share a drink of mead, to sing a quiet song, or to recite words of protection. A prayer to Thor for strength, to Frigg for family, or to household spirits for safety was not superstition to them. It was an armor of the spirit, a way of entering the vulnerable realm of dreams with courage. Dreams themselves held weight. In the Viking worldview, dreams were more than scattered thoughts. They could be omens, messages from the gods, or glimpses of the future. To dream of fire might signal destruction or renewal. To dream of water might bring warnings of journeys or floods. Night was not only cold, it was a passage into a world where the unseen could touch the living. And so, every Viking who closed their eyes on a winter night did so with an awareness that what awaited was more than sleep. It was an encounter with mystery.
Consider also the communal aspect of this experience. In our modern world, the idea of sharing a bed with strangers is strange, even uncomfortable. But in Viking times, it was practical. When travelers came to a longhouse, they might be offered space on a bench or straw beside the family. Warmth was extended, not withheld. Privacy was secondary to survival. And the bonds of hospitality demanded that a guest be treated with care. For tomorrow, one's own family might depend on the kindness of others. This generosity was not without boundaries, but it reflected a culture shaped by environment. In lands where frost could kill the careless, the lesson was simple. Together, one survived. Alone, one perished. Thus, the architecture of homes, the practice of sleeping side by side, the rituals of prayer and storytelling, all were threads woven into a single fabric of survival. Even the architecture of the longhouse reflected this communal need. The roof sloped steeply to shed snow, but the walls curved slightly inward, embracing the family like a sheltering arm. The central hearth was never far from anyone, so even in the darkest corner, the faint warmth of coals could be felt. Smoke blackened the beams above, but that blackness told a story. That fire had burned here, that families had gathered here, that cold had been beaten back night after night.
And so, the Viking way of enduring winter nights was not one solution, but many, layered like the wool they wore. Fire in the hearth, bodies together, animals nearby, straw and fur beneath, prayers whispered above, and stories told to keep the mind strong. These were the shields against the cold, as important as any iron shield carried into battle. To modern ears, it may sound harsh, even miserable. Yet for the Vikings, this was not misery, but life. It was the rhythm of their world, a rhythm as natural as the turning of seasons, as certain as the return of the sun after the longest night. To live was to endure, and to endure was to honor the gods who had made them strong. As the embers dim and the family drifts into slumber, the longhouse is filled with the quiet symphony of survival. The breathing of children, the sigh of animals, the whisper of wind outside. It is not silent, but it is alive. And in that aliveness, warmth is found. Warmth without fire, without radiators, without the inventions of centuries yet to come. Warmth found in the simple truth that survival is never solitary. Let us linger a little longer in the dim glow of a Viking night. The embers crackle faintly, a reminder that even the smallest spark can hold a household together through the cold. But what happens when even those embers fade, when the wind outside grows sharper and the night seems endless? It is here that the full ingenuity of the Vikings becomes clear. For they had to survive not just one night, but an entire season of long darkness, each night colder than the last. Food, too, was part of this survival. A body needed strength to endure the cold, and so what a family ate before bed mattered. Soups of barley, cabbage, and root vegetables, thickened with meat when it was available, were common winter meals. Such heavy fare warmed the body from within, preparing it for the chill of night. Sometimes, children were given a small drink of warm milk before sleeping, or the family shared a sip of ale or mead, not enough to cause drunkenness, but enough to ease the transition into rest. These simple rituals were as vital as the furs on their beds. Imagine a winter feast night when a pig has been slaughtered or fish preserved in salt has been cooked over the fire. The smell fills the hall, bellies are full, and laughter rises louder than the wind. Such nights carried warmth not only in calories but in spirit. To sleep with a full stomach was to sleep with hope, and hope was another blanket against the cold.
But let us turn now to the role of animals more deeply, for they were not only companions but silent guardians of survival. Archaeological evidence shows that in some longhouses, stalls for animals were built directly into the structure, often separated by only a low wooden wall from the human sleeping area. This meant that cows, sheep, and goats shared not only their heat, but their sounds, their smells, their presence. The rhythmic chewing of a cow, the rustle of straw as a goat shifted, these were the lullabies of a Viking night. Dogs, perhaps most of all, held a cherished place. They guarded during the day, hunted in the forests, and at night curled close to their owners. A large hound pressed against a child's legs might mean the difference between numb feet and warmth.
Cats, too, though smaller, were welcome companions. They hunted mice in the straw, keeping bedding free of pests, and their soft fur added a little more comfort to the human hearts that cherished them. Clothing, as we have said, was layered and practical, yet there was artistry too. Viking women were skilled weavers, and the wool they spun was often dyed with natural colors from plants: reds from madder, yellows from birch leaves, blues from woad. These colors brightened the long, dark nights, turning the practical into something beautiful. A cloak of deep blue wool pulled close around the shoulders, a blanket striped with red and gold threads, these were not only warmth, but identity. They reminded the family of who they were, even as the winter tried to strip them bare. The architecture of the longhouse also deserves more attention. Some were built partly into the ground, their lower walls sheltered by earth, which acted as insulation. Others had turf roofs, thick with soil and grass, which trapped heat inside. These designs were not random, but deliberate, drawn from generations of experience. The Vikings understood that to fight the cold, one must work with the land, not against it. Their homes were extensions of the earth itself, blending into the landscape, sturdy against wind and snow. Within the longhouse, light was scarce. Oil lamps made from stone or clay burned with fish oil or animal fat, casting flickering glows. Candles were rarer, a luxury. And so, night was not banished but embraced. Families learned to live in dimness, to let their eyes adjust, to accept shadow as a companion. This acceptance shaped their rhythm of life. They rose with the dim winter sun, worked as much as daylight allowed, and rested long through the dark. Time itself was different, stretched by necessity, shaped by nature. Dreams filled these long nights, and the Vikings listened to them carefully. A man who dreamed of a ship might see it as a sign of a journey to come. A woman who dreamed of wolves might fear danger for her kin. Dreams were discussed at morning meals, weighed against wisdom, and sometimes used to guide choices. They were not idle fantasies, but messages, another way in which the unseen world wove into the seen. Stories, too, continued their work. Let us picture again a grandmother's voice, soft but strong, telling of how Odin sacrificed an eye for wisdom, or how Thor battled the giants of frost. These were not mere tales, but frameworks for survival. If the gods themselves faced hardship, then so could mortals. If even a god could lose and yet rise again, then what was one night's cold compared to the eternal battles of the cosmos? There is also evidence that some Vikings wore protective charms, carved from bone or wood, perhaps in the shape of Thor's hammer. These might be hung above beds or kept close at night, believed to guard against both spirits and the dangers of the cold. The physical and the spiritual were never fully separate in their world. Warmth was a matter of fire and fur, but also of faith. Consider now the comparison to other peoples of medieval Europe. Anglo-Saxons, Celts, and Slavs faced similar challenges, but each adapted differently. Anglo-Saxon homes, for example, were often smaller, with central hearths but less insulation, leading to colder nights.
Slavic peoples sometimes used large communal stoves, heating the structure more evenly, though at the cost of constant fuel. The Vikings, with their longhouses and communal sleeping, found their own balance.
Their culture was not merely shaped by war and seafaring, as legend often tells us, but by the quiet, relentless work of surviving winter. As the night wears on, the Viking family lies close, the air filled with the mingled warmth of bodies and beasts. The fire has faded to embers, glowing faintly like the heartbeat of the house. Outside, the world is frozen, the snow deep, the sky thick with stars. Inside, life persists. And that persistence is the true story of how Vikings survived their coldest nights. By weaving together every resource, every relationship, every ritual into a tapestry of survival that no frost could unravel. The Viking night was not simply endured, it was a theater of strategies, where every small decision, where to place the fire, how to weave the blankets, when to bring the animals in, was part of a greater choreography of survival. If we pause for a moment and listen to the quiet of the longhouse, we can almost hear this rhythm. The crackle of wood, the low murmur of voices fading into silence, the soft shuffle of animals settling into straw. It was not comfort as we know it today, but it was enough. Enough to keep life moving through winters that seemed designed to stop it. Let us return to the hearth, the heart of the Viking household. Though fire was central, it was not always used in the way modern people might expect. Fuel was precious, and not every family could afford to burn wood through the long night. Instead, fires were often left to smolder, embers glowing in the center of the hall, their heat slowly dissipating into the air. The smoke lingered, heavy and pungent, clinging to hair, clothing, and rafters. But in that smoke lay protection, against insects, against rot, even against the cold itself. A smoky longhouse was a lived-in longhouse, and the acrid air was the smell of endurance. The construction of the hearth itself was clever. Stones lined the pit to hold heat, and ashes were often banked over embers to keep them alive until morning. A careful hand might stir the ashes in the night, coaxing a faint glow to keep warmth alive without open flame. Fire-making tools were not as convenient as matches or lighters. Iron strikers and flint were needed, and a spark could take effort to catch. To preserve embers through the night was to save labor at dawn, to guarantee that the first light of day did not begin with shivering hands striking stone in desperation. Bedding, too, was more complex than it first appears. Straw, while plentiful, compressed quickly, losing its softness and insulation. Families would regularly replace or refresh the straw, a task that required effort but prevented illness. Damp straw was dangerous, for moisture bred cold, and cold bred sickness. And so the maintenance of bedding was part of survival. Over this base came layers of hides and furs, some so heavy that lifting them required strength. Yet beneath such weight, warmth was trapped, cocooning bodies in a fragile bubble of safety. Now consider the act of sleeping itself. To us, 8 uninterrupted hours might seem natural, but in the world of the Vikings, segmented sleep was common. Families might drift into slumber shortly after nightfall, wake in the middle of the night for an hour or two, and then sleep again until dawn. This wakeful interlude was not wasted. It was a time for quiet tasks, mending clothes, tending to embers, whispering prayers, or checking on animals. Sometimes it was a time for intimacy, for strengthening bonds that kept the family close through hardship. The rhythm of segmented sleep matched the rhythm of survival, practical, flexible, responsive to the needs of both body and home. The communal nature of this sleeping arrangement cannot be overstated. Imagine a longhouse with 20 people, a large extended family, servants, perhaps travelers seeking shelter.
Privacy vanished, but warmth increased. In the press of bodies, in the shared breath clouding the cold air, life was sustained. For children, this closeness was reassurance. For the elderly, it was comfort. For travelers, it was hospitality. In a world of cold, warmth was wealth, and to share it was both generosity and duty. Let us not forget the role of sounds in this environment. Outside, the wind howled through trees, wolves howled from distant forests, and the ice cracked under the weight of snow. Inside, the sounds were different. The bleating of a goat shifting in its stall, the steady breathing of family members, the soft hiss of an ember breaking. These sounds formed the soundtrack of Viking nights. To modern ears, they might seem intrusive, but to the Vikings, they were familiar, even comforting. The noise of life was preferable to the silence of death. As the night continued, spiritual concerns intertwined with physical ones. The Vikings believed the world was filled with unseen beings, spirits of land, water, and sky, as well as ancestors who watched over the living. Night was a time when these presences were felt most strongly. A creak in the rafters might be dismissed as wood shifting in the cold, but it could also be interpreted as a spirit passing by. A dream of an ancestor might be seen as guidance. Thus, prayers and charms were woven into nightly routines, not out of superstition alone, but out of deep cultural understanding that life and death, warmth and cold, the physical and the spiritual were all intertwined. Women in the household played a central role in these nightly rituals. They prepared the bedding, oversaw the clothing of children, and often kept charms or symbols for protection. A carved amulet of Thor's hammer, a bundle of herbs hung near the bed, or a whispered blessing were as important as any fur or cloak. The work of women in preserving warmth was not only practical, but sacred, tying the household together in both body and spirit. Meanwhile, the men, though often absent on journeys or raids, contributed by ensuring the home was supplied with wood, meat, and wool. When they were present, their duties continued into the night, checking that the structure was sound, that snow had not collapsed a roof, that animals were secured. Winter was not a season of rest, but of vigilance. Every task was survival, and survival never slept. What of the youngest members of the household? Viking children were not spared from the realities of the cold. From infancy, they were swaddled in wool and fur, kept close to their mothers at night. As they grew, they learned to accept the chill, to wrap themselves tightly, to huddle with siblings. These experiences shaped them, hardening their bodies and minds. By adulthood, the cold was no longer an enemy, but a familiar companion, one they knew how to respect and resist. The comparison to other medieval cultures offers perspective here. While Vikings relied on communal warmth and animal presence, some cultures developed different methods. In Slavic regions, clay stoves radiated heat through entire homes, creating a more even warmth. In parts of the British Isles, peat fires smoldered, giving long-lasting heat but filling homes with thick smoke. Each culture adapted differently, but the Viking method was uniquely suited to their mobile, communal, and seafaring way of life. It was not perfection, but it was survival, and survival was enough. To appreciate this fully, let us walk through a night in detail. The family gathers at dusk, eating their meal together, perhaps fish from the fjord or bread from stored grain. After eating, they sit by the fire, sharing stories. As darkness deepens, the animals are settled, children tucked into bedding. Cloaks are spread over bodies, furs pulled close. The fire is banked, embers left to smolder. The first sleep begins, the longhouse filled with the sound of quiet breathing. Hours later, someone stirs. Perhaps the father rises to check the embers, stirring ashes with a stick to reveal a faint glow. He adds a small piece of wood, enough to bring warmth but not enough to blaze. A child awakens, murmurs a question about a dream, and the grandmother answers softly, interpreting its meaning. A mother adjusts a blanket, pulling it tighter around her youngest. Then silence returns, and the second sleep begins. Outside, the world remains hostile, but inside, the fragile balance of survival holds. This cycle repeats night after night, winter after winter, shaping the rhythm of Viking life. It was not a matter of comfort, but of endurance, not of luxury, but of necessity. And yet, within this necessity, there was beauty. The beauty of family closeness, of shared struggle, of resilience woven into every breath. In the end, what the Vikings understood was simple. Heat was not only fire. Heat was community, faith, resourcefulness, and will.
It was the glow of embers, the warmth of wool, the press of bodies, the blessing of gods, and the stories that carried the heart through darkness. This was how they survived the coldest nights of the year without what we would call heat, by finding warmth where others might not think to look. As we journey further into the Viking night, it becomes clear that what we call survival was, for them, simply life. They did not view the cold as an exceptional hardship, but as the constant backdrop against which their existence unfolded. To us, their strategies might seem extreme: sleeping with livestock, breathing smoke-filled air, bundling together in the same bed. But to them, it was as natural as the turning of the seasons. The Viking winter was not a crisis, but a teacher, shaping their habits, their households, and even their worldview. Let us pause on the longhouse once more, for it was more than a building. It was a microcosm of the Viking world, a space where every element of survival converged. Its length and size allowed multiple generations to live together: grandparents, parents, children, sometimes even servants or foster children. Fostering, after all, was a Viking custom, where children were sometimes raised in the households of allies to strengthen ties between families. In the deep of winter, this meant even more bodies under one roof, more warmth shared, and more stories told. Within this communal setting, the role of hierarchy remained strong. The head of the household decided where guests would sleep, who tended to the fire, who checked the animals at night. But survival blurred some lines. When the cold was fiercest, the needs of the body outweighed rank. Even a chieftain might find himself sleeping near the hearth, while a thrall or servant curled at his feet, both equally dependent on the glow of fading embers. The thralls, the enslaved workers of Viking society, often endured the harshest conditions. Yet even they were part of the survival structure, their bodies contributing to the shared heat of the longhouse. Their presence in winter nights reminds us that survival was not romantic or heroic. It was collective, and sometimes it was cruel. But without the thralls, many households would have struggled to maintain their farms, their animals, and their supplies. And so, even in bondage, their role in survival was undeniable. Supplies themselves were crucial. A Viking household prepared for winter with months of labor during the warmer seasons. Grains were harvested and stored in wooden bins or ceramic vessels. Dried fish and meat were salted or smoked, and ale was brewed. These stores provided not just food, but warmth, for the energy of a meal was as much a defense against the cold as any fur. On nights when supplies were plentiful, the family could sleep with full bellies, their bodies better equipped to produce heat. On nights when food was scarce, the cold cut deeper, hunger gnawed, and sleep was less a comfort than a battle. Consider the role of drink as well. Mead, ale, or warmed milk served not only as sustenance, but as a comfort before bed.
The faint flush of alcohol or the soothing heaviness of warm milk helped the body relax, helped the mind forget the cold just long enough to drift into dreams. And those dreams, once again, carried meaning. To the Viking imagination, the night was not empty, but alive. The sagas speak of Draugr, restless dead who haunted the living, especially in the dark of winter. A creak outside might be the wind, or it might be something more sinister. This belief gave urgency to prayers and charms before sleep. Thor's hammer worn around the neck or a simple carving placed by the bed became more than symbols. They were defenses, shields against the unknown. Thus, a Viking child drifting to sleep under a bearskin was not only wrapped in fur, but in layers of faith and ritual. Even the positioning of sleepers mattered. Some evidence suggests that families arranged themselves deliberately, with the youngest and weakest in the center, surrounded by stronger bodies to shield them from drafts. This formation was instinctive, protective, much like animals huddling together for warmth. The longhouse became less a building and more a living organism, each member contributing to the survival of the whole. Let us compare this with cultures to the east and south. In Russia and other Slavic lands, the great stove, the pech, was central to the home. People slept directly on or near it, its warmth radiating through brick and clay. In Central Europe, families sometimes slept in lofts above stables, letting animal heat rise beneath them. In the Celtic regions of the British Isles, peat fires burned steadily, filling homes with both warmth and smoke. Each adaptation reflects the same truth. Humans have always been ingenious in the face of cold. The Viking solution, communal sleeping, layered clothing, turf-roofed longhouses, was their particular genius. And while much of this survival was practical, there was also beauty. Viking textiles, though practical, were often decorated with patterns, stripes, or bright dyes. Blankets might be woven with intricate designs, cloaks trimmed with fur. Jewelry, even simple bronze brooches, gleamed by the firelight as cloaks were fastened at night. To sleep wrapped in such garments was not only survival, but dignity. It was a reminder that even in hardship there was room for beauty, for identity, for pride. The cold also influenced social bonds. When a traveler was welcomed into a longhouse on a winter night, the act was more than hospitality, it was salvation. To refuse shelter might mean condemning someone to death. Thus, hospitality became sacred, woven into law and custom. The guest, in turn, was expected to bring news, stories, or gifts. On these winter nights, a stranger might share tales from distant lands, easing the monotony of long darkness and reminding the household that the world was larger than their frozen valley. Winter nights also shaped Viking storytelling itself. The sagas we know today, though written down centuries later, were born from oral tradition, passed from mouth to mouth, fire to fire, across countless long winters. Each story told in the longhouse was not only entertainment, but preservation, of history, of values, of identity. Without winter, perhaps the sagas would never have been so deeply woven into the Viking soul. The cold, enforcing families to gather close, gave birth to stories that have endured 1,000 years. So let us walk once more through such a night. Outside, the aurora borealis shimmers faintly, green ribbons unfurling across the black sky. The snow glitters like a sea of diamonds under the moon. Inside, the longhouse is dim, lit only by the faint glow of oil lamps and embers. Children murmur in sleep, an old man snores softly, a dog shifts and sighs. The smell of smoke and straw hangs thick, but it is familiar, even comforting.
A mother whispers a final prayer. A father checks the latch of the door, and slowly silence claims the hall. Yet it is not a silence of emptiness. It is the silence of endurance, of strength, of countless generations who learned that survival was not about defeating the cold, but about living with it. The Vikings did not conquer winter, they adapted to it, folded it into their lives, and in doing so became stronger. Every night survived was a victory, every dawn a gift. And in this way, the coldest nights of the year were not only endured, they were transformed into nights of closeness, of stories, of dreams, of faith. They were nights that shaped a people, forged in frost, bound together by the simple but profound act of keeping one another warm. When we think of winter in the Viking Age, it is tempting to imagine only the cold, the snow piled high, the frost on every surface, the endless nights stretching into silence. But within that silence lay a world of activity, of small acts that together created the possibility of survival. The Viking night was not empty. It was filled with purpose, with rituals both practical and spiritual, with gestures that bound families together through the darkness. Let us look closer at the rhythms of such nights, for each stage of the evening carried its own meaning. At dusk, after the last tasks outside were done, feeding animals, chopping wood, drawing water, the family retreated indoors. The longhouse door was closed, sometimes with a heavy wooden latch, sometimes with furs hung across it to block drafts. This moment of closure marked the beginning of the night, the withdrawal into a world apart from the storm and cold. Inside, the first priority was warmth from food. Supper might be simple. Porridge of barley or oats, perhaps flavored with dried berries or a bit of honey. On better nights, there was meat, preserved from the autumn slaughter, or fish pulled from icy rivers. These meals were eaten quickly, often from shared wooden bowls, with spoons carved from bone or wood. Eating together was more than nourishment. It was a reassurance that everyone had survived another day, that there was enough to continue. After supper came the time for stories. Elders, whose labor was less in winter, found their voices at night. They told of heroes, voyages, gods, and monsters, their words rising with the smoke. Children listened wide-eyed, their imaginations filling the shadows with images of frost giants and far-off lands. Adults listened too, not as entertainment alone, but as a reminder of who they were, of the values that shaped their lives. Courage, endurance, loyalty, these were not abstract ideas, but daily necessities, woven into stories so that each generation would carry them forward. The role of women in these nights cannot be overstated. While men often dominated the sagas with their deeds, within the longhouse it was women who held families together. They spun wool by firelight, mended clothes, prepared food, and ensured children were wrapped in layers of warmth. A mother's careful eye kept embers glowing, kept straw dry, kept blankets tight around small bodies. In these nightly acts, survival was preserved not by sword or axe, but by patience and care. The fire itself, though small, remained central. Families learned to use it sparingly, placing larger logs early in the evening, then banking coals under ash to keep them smoldering through the night. Children were taught not to play too close, not only to avoid burns, but to avoid wasting precious fuel. In some homes, the hearth was raised slightly above the floor, its stones radiating heat for hours. This quiet engineering was as important as any raid or voyage, for without it, the nights could have been deadly. Consider too the role of light. Oil lamps, carved from stone or clay, flickered with fish oil. Their glow was weak but steady, casting long shadows on the walls. These shadows, dancing as the flames moved, gave life to the stories told. A child might see Odin's one eye in the flicker, or Thor's hammer in the shape of smoke. Night became a stage where imagination turned necessity into wonder. And yet, for all the warmth of stories, fear remained. The night was long, and in the Viking imagination, darkness was never empty. The sagas speak of trolls, spirits, and draugon, undead beings who could rise from graves, often in the cold silence of winter. These fears gave power to charms and prayers. A Thor's hammer hung above the door, runes carved into wood, herbs scattered on the hearth. All were defenses, spiritual shields against threats that could not be seen. A family lying together in a longhouse did not sleep without protection. They carried into their rest the weight of centuries of belief. Segmented sleep, as we mentioned, added structure to the night. Between the first and second sleep, the longhouse stirred gently. Adults might speak quietly, planning for the days ahead or reflecting on dreams. Lovers might find one another in the darkness, intimacy strengthened by the hush of night. Children might ask questions, their voices sleepy but curious. These hours were not wasted. They were filled with the quiet work of maintaining life, both physical and emotional. Dreams themselves were taken seriously. A dream of the sea could be interpreted as a call to voyage, a dream of wolves as a warning of danger. Dream interpreters, often women skilled in lore, could shape how a family understood their future. A dream told at breakfast might guide the day's choices, its meaning debated by elders who had seen many winters. In this way, the cold nights became a source of guidance, as though the silence of winter itself whispered truths to those who listened. Let us not forget the importance of animals in this nightly picture. The breath of cows, the shuffle of goats, the warmth of sheep, all contributed to the temperature of the hall. Archaeological remains of longhouses often show built-in stalls, proof that humans and animals shared space not only in work but in rest. Dogs, always faithful, curled near their owners, while cats kept watch against mice. Their presence was not decoration but survival, each creature part of the household's collective warmth. In comparing Viking practices to those of other lands, the uniqueness of their solution shines brighter. While other cultures relied on stoves or steady fires, the Vikings trusted in community. Their survival came from bodies pressed together, from shared breath, from the closeness that winter demanded. It was a method both simple and profound, reminding us that warmth does not always come from flames. Now imagine one such night in vivid detail. The snow outside is falling heavily, muffling the world into silence. Inside, the longhouse is dim, the air thick with the smell of smoke and animals. A child stirs, pulling a sheepskin tighter. A mother hums a soft song, barely more than a whisper. A father rises, stirs the embers, adds a small log. Sparks glow briefly, then fade into red warmth. The family settles again, their breathing steady, their bodies pressed close. The cold presses at the walls, but it does not enter. Together they are stronger than the frost. The beauty of this survival lies in its ordinariness. There was no miracle technology, no invention to banish the cold. There was only adaptation, patience, and the simple, powerful truth that humans survive best when they do so together. The Vikings knew this truth intimately. Every winter taught it anew. Every night confirmed it. In the end, their survival was not about defeating the cold, but about living with it, learning from it, and shaping their culture around its lessons. Thus, when we speak of the Vikings as fierce raiders and explorers, we must also remember them as families in longhouses,
wrapped in furs, telling stories by the fire, listening to the breath of animals, and waiting for dawn. Their true strength was not only in battle, but in endurance, in the ability to make warmth without heat, to turn the coldest nights into nights of resilience and closeness. The Viking night, as we have seen, was layered with strategies, rituals, and stories. Yet to fully understand how they endured the coldest season, we must also look at how those nights connected to the larger rhythm of their year. For winter was not an isolated experience. It was the culmination of everything that had come before, the final test of harvests, hunts, and preparations. Each night under fur and straw was shaped by decisions made in summer and autumn, by labor in fields and forests, by voyages across seas. Consider the preparation of fuel. Wood was cut and stacked long before snow fell. Pine and birch were favored, though in some places wood was scarce, and families turned to peat or dried animal dung for fuel. Each log placed on the fire at night carried the memory of a summer's day, when axes rang in the forest and men hauled timber back to the settlement. Fuel was never taken for granted. A wasted log meant a colder night later. Thus, thrift and foresight warmed the longhouse as much as embers did. Food, too, was the product of months of effort. Fish dried on racks in the summer became stews in winter. Meat smoked in autumn became meals by the hearth. Grain stored in chests became porridge to sustain bodies through the long dark. To lie in a longhouse at night with a full belly was to feel the weight of months of labor, each bite a link in the chain of survival. Hunger haunted many households, and when food was scarce, nights became more brutal. Children whimpered in sleep, elders weakened, and the cold seemed sharper. Yet even then, families endured, relying on each other to share what little warmth and nourishment remained. The spiritual dimension of these nights must also be remembered. The Vikings lived in a world where gods and spirits were ever present, where natural forces were imbued with personality and will. Winter nights were sacred in their own way. The festival of Yule, celebrated during the darkest days, was both a feast and a ritual of survival. Fires burned brighter, animals were sacrificed, mead was drunk, and songs filled the hall. Yule was not only a celebration, but a defiance, a statement that even in the grip of the longest night, life would not yield.
Families told tales of Odin wandering the skies, of the wild hunt sweeping across the heavens, of ancestors visiting in the dark. These beliefs gave meaning to the cold, turning nights of hardship into nights of mystery and connection. Dreams during Yule carried particular weight. A dream of fire could mean good fortune. A dream of death could warn of sickness. Families listened carefully, interpreting these messages as guidance for the year to come. In this way, the nights were not passive endurance, but active dialogue with the unseen, shaping choices and beliefs. Now, let us look more closely at children once again, for they were at the heart of survival. From the moment they were born, they were introduced to the cold. Babies were swaddled in wool and fur, kept close to mothers at night. As they grew, they learned to wrap themselves, to share warmth with siblings, to listen for the sounds of the longhouse. Their education in survival began not with books, but with nights in winter, with lessons in patience, resilience, and closeness. To be Viking was to learn to live with the cold, not to fight it, but to accept it as part of existence. Elders, too, had a special place in these nights. Though their bodies were frailer, their minds carried decades of experience. They advised on dreams, told stories, and offered prayers. Their presence in the longhouse was both practical and symbolic. They were the link to the past, the proof that survival was possible, that many winters could be endured. Children looked to them not only for tales of gods, but for the living example of resilience.
The social bonds forged in these conditions cannot be overlooked. Hospitality, as mentioned before, was sacred. A guest taken in on a winter night was bound to the household, and the household bound to the guest. Refusing shelter could mean death, and so kindness became law. This law of warmth extended beyond the practical. It was spiritual. To welcome another into the glow of your fire was to share not only heat, but fate. And when those guests departed, they carried stories of generosity that strengthened bonds between families and communities. Outside the longhouse, the landscape itself shaped survival. Snow-blanketed fields, frozen rivers glistened, forests stood silent and heavy with frost. The aurora danced above, green and purple curtains in the sky, reminding those below of powers far greater than themselves. To walk outside at night, wrapped in furs, was to feel both small and connected, fragile against the cold, but also part of a vast world of gods and spirits. These moments of awe nourished the spirit, strengthening the will to endure. Archaeology helps us glimpse this world. Remains of longhouses show how walls were layered with turf for insulation, how hearths were central, how stalls for animals were integrated. Fragments of wool, fur, and leather tell of clothing layered for warmth. Amulets shaped like Thor's hammer, found in graves and settlements, confirm the role of faith in daily life. Each artifact is a whisper from the past, reminding us that survival was not an accident, but a craft, a deliberate weaving of material and spiritual strategies. Let us imagine one more winter night in vivid detail. The longhouse lies in silence. Outside, snow drifts against the walls, muffling every sound. Inside, the hearth glows faintly, embers covered with ash. Families lie close, wrapped in furs, their breaths rising into the smoky air. A child murmurs in sleep, dreaming of a wolf. A grandmother wakes briefly, whispers a prayer to Frigg, and falls back into slumber. A dog lifts its head, ears pricked, then rests again. Hours pass, the cold pressing against the walls, but the warmth of bodies holds steady. When dawn comes, weak and pale, it finds the family alive, weary but whole. Another night survived, another step through winter. This cycle repeated not for days, but for months. Each night a reminder of the fragility and strength of life. In enduring the coldest nights, the Vikings forged not only their survival, but their identity. They became a people of endurance, of adaptation, of closeness. Their sagas may sing of battles and voyages, but their true heroism lay also in these long nights, where survival was a collective act, where warmth was found not in fire alone, but in the bonds of family, faith, and community. And so, when we ask how the Vikings survived the coldest nights of the year without heat, the answer is not simple. They survived with straw and fur, with animals and cloaks, with smoke and embers, with prayers and stories. They survived with each other. They survived because they understood that warmth is not only a matter of flames, but of connection. Connection to family, to gods, to ancestors, to the land itself. This was their greatest strength, the quiet endurance that carried them through winter after winter, generation after generation. The Viking night was a crucible, but it was also a canvas upon which daily life was painted in shades of resilience. Each detail, no matter how small, added to the whole picture of survival. To fully step into their world, we must imagine not only the practicalities of warmth, but also the texture, the sound, and the spirit of those long hours, where time itself seemed slower, stretched by the silence of snow and the heaviness of darkness. Let us begin with the longhouse again, for it was more than shelter, it was memory itself. Imagine walking into one on a winter evening. The doorway is low, forcing you to bow as you enter, a gesture of humility. The air is heavy with smoke, your eyes adjust slowly to the dimness, and shapes emerge. Benches along the walls, a central hearth glowing faintly, furs and cloaks draped across bodies huddled together. Animals shift at the far end, their presence as much a part of the home as the people. It is not grand, it is not luxurious, but it is alive. Every beam, every stone, every patch of turf is part of the struggle against the cold. The sounds of the night are their own language. The creak of timber as frost tightens its grip. The soft exhale of a sleeping cow. The rustle of straw as a child rolls over in sleep. The occasional cough, the crackle of an ember, the sigh of wind slipping through gaps in the wall. These sounds are not intrusions, they are reminders that life continues. In a world where silence could mean death, noise was a blessing. The role of smell should not be forgotten either. The scent of smoke permeated everything, clothing, hair, even the skin. Mixed with it were the smells of animals, of wool, of cooked food lingering in the air. To us, it might seem unpleasant, but to the Vikings, it was home. The smell of smoke was safety. The smell of animals was survival. The smell of food was reassurance. Every breath in the longhouse carried these reminders, reinforcing the sense of belonging to a space built for endurance. The tactile experience of the night was equally vivid. Straw beneath one's body, rough but insulating. Furs heavy on top, coarse against the skin but warm. Woolen cloaks wrapped tightly, the weave thick, scratchy, yet protective. The body was never untouched by texture, never separate from the materials of survival. These sensations became as natural as breathing, shaping the Vikings' perception of comfort. The layering of clothing was both science and art. Wool, as mentioned before, was their greatest ally. But within that, there was variety. Some garments were finely woven for wealthier families, soft against the skin. Others were coarse, thick, made for hard labor. Undergarments of linen added softness, while outer layers of fur provided insulation. Cloaks, often fastened with bronze or iron brooches, doubled as bedding at night. Caps and mittens completed the ensemble, ensuring that even extremities were protected. In this way, a Viking family entered sleep not by changing into nightclothes, but by transforming their day garments into a cocoon of warmth. The communal nature of sleep continued to reinforce social bonds. Families often arranged themselves deliberately. The youngest children, most vulnerable to cold, were placed between parents or older siblings. Elders were given warmer spots closer to the hearth, not only out of respect, but out of necessity. Servants and thralls were included in this arrangement, though usually on the edges, still contributing to the collective warmth. In this closeness, personal space was not a concept. Survival erased such boundaries, and warmth became a shared resource, distributed by proximity. And then there were the animals.
Archaeology confirms that many longhouses contained stalls for livestock, especially in the winter months. The warmth of animals was practical, but their presence was also spiritual. In Norse mythology, animals held deep significance. Cats were sacred to Freya, goddess of love and fertility. Goats pulled Thor's chariot. Horses were linked to fertility and power. To sleep near animals was not only to benefit from their heat, but to dwell with beings that carried symbolic weight, companions in both survival and belief. Rituals before sleep provided another layer of defense, not against cold, but against fear. Prayers to household gods, charms carved with runes, and simple gestures of protection were common. A father might whisper to Thor for strength.
A mother might call upon Frigg for family safety. A child might clutch a carved amulet of a hammer or a small stone believed to hold power. These practices gave reassurance, turning vulnerability into trust. The segmented sleep pattern added rhythm to the night. In the period between first and second sleep, small tasks were done. Clothes were mended by firelight, weapons sharpened, or tools inspected. Couples spoke softly, sharing thoughts or worries. Elders told stories too long for the waking day, their voices low but steady. This interlude broke the monotony, transforming night into a series of manageable parts. By dividing the darkness, the Vikings reduced its weight, giving themselves markers of progress toward dawn. And then there were dreams. For the Vikings, dreams were never meaningless. They were messages, sometimes from gods, sometimes from ancestors, sometimes from the hidden parts of one's own spirit. A dream of fire could signify destruction or renewal. A dream of animals might foretell fertility or loss. Dreams of journeys could be omens of raids, voyages, or deaths.
Families shared these dreams in the morning, interpreting them together, seeking meaning in the silent language of the night. Dreams, in this way, became part of the survival strategy, not physically, but emotionally, spiritually, guiding choices and strengthening belief. Yule, the great midwinter festival, highlighted all these practices. During Yule, nights were filled not only with survival, but with ritual. Fires burned longer, sacrifices were made to gods, and families feasted despite scarcity. The longest night of the year was turned into celebration, a defiant act against the power of winter. Songs filled the halls, mead was drunk, and the line between living and dead was believed to blur. Ancestors were honored, spirits acknowledged, gods invoked. In this way, Yule transformed the coldest, darkest nights into nights of meaning and joy, moments when survival became triumph. Comparisons with other medieval cultures again highlight the distinctiveness of the Viking approach. In some European villages, people relied heavily on architecture, stone hearths, clay ovens, enclosed stoves. The Vikings, by contrast, placed greater emphasis on communal closeness and layered clothing. Their longhouses were functional, but their true strength lay in how families adapted themselves, not just their buildings. It was survival rooted in human bonds rather than technological innovation. Let us return to an imagined night, this time during Yule. The longhouses crowded, voices rising in song. A feast has just ended, the air thick with the smell of roasted meat and spiced ale. Children laugh, chasing each other briefly before sleep claims them. Adults share stories of past raids, of voyages across seas, of gods who walked among men. Then, slowly, the hall quiets. Families curl together, cloaks pulled tight, embers glowing faintly. Outside, snow falls silently, but inside, warmth radiates not only from fire and bodies, but from spirit, from the knowledge that even the longest night will end. It is in these moments that we glimpse the true resilience of the Vikings. Their strength was not only in axes or ships, but in the quiet determination to endure night after night, to survive not just with heat, but with closeness, with faith, with stories. Their legacy is not only sagas of war, but sagas of endurance, of lives lived fully in a world that demanded every ounce of ingenuity. And so, when dawn finally comes, pale and cold, it reveals not just survivors, but people shaped by survival. The Vikings who step into the light are not simply raiders or explorers. They are the children of winter, the keepers of warmth in a world that offered little. Their survival of the coldest nights, without heat as we know it, is a testament to the power of community, of resilience, and of the human spirit. The coldest Viking nights were not endured in isolation.
They were part of a cycle that stretched across generations, a rhythm that bound families to their ancestors and descendants alike. To understand these nights, we must not only see the practical measures of straw, fur, and embers, but also the deeper continuity they represented. Each winter night was a link in an unbroken chain, proof that survival was possible, that life could persist even when the earth itself seemed frozen in silence. Let us look closer at the architecture of longhouses as symbols of this continuity. These structures were not temporary shelters, but enduring homes, sometimes lasting for decades. Built with timber frames, their walls reinforced with turf, they were both sturdy and flexible. The very materials tied them to the land: wood from nearby forests, earth from the fields, straw from the harvest. To sleep in a longhouse was to sleep inside the land itself, embraced by its resources, shielded by its strength. The house was not just a building, but a partner in survival, a companion that endured the cold alongside its inhabitants. The longhouse also reflected the values of the society. Its central hearth was a gathering place, not a private luxury. Heat, light, and food radiated outward from this center, binding everyone together. Even the arrangement of sleeping spaces reflected hierarchy and necessity. The most honored places were near the fire, but in practice, warmth was shared widely. In the depth of winter, distinctions of rank blurred. Warmth did not respect status. It respected bodies pressed together, cloaks pulled tight, breath mingling in the smoky air. We must not underestimate the role of smoke itself. In modern minds, smoke is pollution, discomfort. But for the Vikings, it was insulation, protection, even preservation. Smoke filled the rafters, driving away insects, slowing rot, and sealing in warmth. It blackened wood until it gleamed darkly, a sign of years of survival. To breathe smoky air at night was to breathe the history of a household, each particle a memory of fires past. Though harsh on lungs and eyes, smoke was as much a companion as the fire itself. Now let us turn to the role of rituals more deeply. Before sleeping, many families would have engaged in small acts of devotion. These were not formal ceremonies, but quiet gestures. A whispered prayer to Odin, a small offering to the household spirits, a charm hung above the bed. These rituals acknowledge the fragility of life, the vulnerability of sleep. In their worldview, to fall asleep was to step partly into another realm, one where spirits and gods could touch the living. Protection was needed, not only from the cold, but from the unseen forces that moved in the night. Dreams reinforced this worldview. Imagine a child waking in the middle of the night, frightened by a dream of wolves. The grandmother might murmur that it was a warning, that the gods had spoken, and the family would take care the next day. Such interpretations gave meaning to fear, transforming it into guidance. A dream was never just a dream. It was a thread in the larger fabric of existence, woven into choices, actions, and stories. In this way, the long nights became not only endurance, but communication, a dialogue between human beings and the mysteries beyond them. Hospitality, too, gained greater weight in these conditions. To open one's longhouse to a traveler on a cold night was to share more than shelter. It was to share survival. Guests became part of the warmth, their bodies adding to the collective heat, their stories adding to the collective spirit. Refusing shelter could mean condemning someone to death, a choice few could make without dishonor. Thus, hospitality became sacred law, rooted not only in kindness, but in necessity. The cold forged a culture where generosity was as much a weapon against death as a sword in battle. Children learned these values through experience. They grew up not only hearing stories of gods, but living stories of survival. Each winter taught them patience, resilience, and interdependence. They learned that their small bodies, though fragile, contributed to the warmth of the group. They learned to listen to the wisdom of elders, to respect the work of women, to trust in the protection of fathers and brothers. Their education was not in books, but in nights endured together, in the lessons whispered by smoke and silence. Elders, in turn, were revered not only for wisdom, but for their proven ability to endure. Every wrinkle on their faces, every story told, carried the weight of winters survived. Their presence at night was reassurance. If they had endured so many, then surely the children could endure this one. Their stories were not mere entertainment, but testimonies, evidence that survival was possible, that hardship could be outlasted. The cold itself became a kind of teacher. It demanded foresight, discipline, cooperation. It punished waste and rewarded thrift. It revealed the strength of bonds, exposing households where unity prevailed and those where discord weakened survival. In this way, winter was not only a season, but a crucible, shaping the character of families and communities. Those who emerged in spring were stronger, not only in body, but in spirit. Let us compare once more to other medieval cultures. In some European regions, winters were milder, and survival did not demand such closeness. Privacy, larger homes, and more fuel allowed different habits. But in Scandinavia, the climate made such luxuries impossible. The Vikings adapted not by resisting this reality, but by embracing it. They accepted closeness, smoke, and the mingling of humans and animals as the natural way of life. In doing so, they created a culture of resilience that carried them not only through winters, but across seas, into battles, and into history. Imagine again a winter night. The aurora borealis flickers faintly overhead, unseen by those inside, but present all the same, a silent reminder of cosmic forces. Within the longhouse, a child stirs, whispering of a dream. The grandmother interprets, the mother soothes, the father stirs the embers. The dog curls tighter, the cow exhales, the family settles again. Outside, the snow drifts higher against the walls. Inside, warmth holds. The night is endured, not by fire alone, but by faith, by closeness, by the unbroken will to survive. When dawn arrives, it is pale, the sun weak, but it is enough. Families rise, shake straw from their cloaks, feed animals, and prepare for another day. The memory of the night remains, but it is not lamented. It is accepted, part of life. And so the cycle continues, night after night, winter after winter. Survival written not in battles or voyages, but in the quiet strength of ordinary lives. This was the true resilience of the Vikings, not only their ability to raid or explore, but their ability to endure the simplest, harshest challenge, the cold. Their sagas tell of gods and heroes, but their greatest saga was survival itself, repeated endlessly in the smoky halls of their homes, whispered in prayers, preserved in dreams, and carried forward in the warmth of generations yet to come. The Viking winter night was not only about survival in the present moment, it was about carrying memory, tradition, and identity through the long, cold hours into the dawn. Each generation inherited the strategies of the last, and in turn passed them on to the next. This continuity gave the Viking people a strength that went beyond muscle and weapon. It was the strength of knowledge, embedded in routine, in ritual, in the very walls of their longhouses. Let us turn our attention again to food, for it was as much a shield against the cold as furs or cloaks. Meals before sleep were carefully chosen. Warm porridge of barley or oats could sustain through the night, heavy in the belly, radiating warmth as it digested. Fish, salted and stored, was common. Meat, preserved by smoking or drying, offered protein and energy. On rare occasions, there might be butter or cheese, rich and nourishing. Every bite was precious, for it meant not only survival through that night, but strength for the next day's work. A hungry body shivered more, wasted energy faster, succumbed quicker to the cold. Thus, the sharing of food at night was as sacred as the sharing of blankets. The act of sharing itself bound families closer. Wooden bowls were passed around, spoons dipped into the same dish. Children ate from their parents' hands, elders given the choicest portions in recognition of their age and wisdom. In this way, meals reinforced hierarchy and respect, but also unity. By the time the bowls were emptied and the fire banked, the household had not only nourished their bodies, but renewed the bonds that tied them together. After meals and stories came the rituals of settling down for rest. Straw was rearranged, furs shaken out, cloaks spread. Children were tucked between parents, elders covered with extra layers. Animals shifted into their stalls, their sounds fading into the background hum of the hall. Oil lamps were extinguished one by one until only the faint glow of embers remained. The hall sank into shadow, the rhythm of breathing became steady, and night claimed its dominion. It is here, in the heart of the night, that the Viking strategies are most visible. They understood drafts were deadly, and so furs or even wooden planks were used to block gaps in the walls. They understood that embers needed tending, and so someone always rose in the middle of the night to stir the fire. They understood that bodies generated heat, and so they pressed close together. They understood that fear weakened the spirit, and so they told stories and whispered prayers. Each strategy was simple, but together they formed a web of survival, strong enough to outlast even the longest nights. One might ask, what of sickness? Surely in smoky halls, crowded with animals, illness spread easily. And it did. Coughs and fevers were common, especially in winter. But here again, closeness was both danger and salvation. Families nursed the sick together, sharing warmth, bringing food and drink, offering charms and prayers. Illness was not faced alone, but as a collective. This communal care reflected the Viking understanding that survival was never solitary. If one member suffered, all worked to endure it. Let us return to dreams once more, for they colored these nights with meaning. Dreams were seen not only as omens, but as visitations. A child dreaming of a lost ancestor might wake and believe they had been visited, protected. A warrior dreaming of battle might see it as a warning or a call to courage. Dreams were shared in the morning, interpreted by elders, woven into the fabric of daily life. In this way, the night became more than darkness. It became a realm of communication between worlds, shaping choices and beliefs. And always there was storytelling. The sagas we know, of Odin and Thor, of voyages and battles, were kept alive in these smoky halls. They were not recited in grand, formal performances, but in the quiet moments of winter nights, when families needed distraction, courage, and wonder. Storytelling was a survival strategy as real as straw or fur, for it kept the spirit warm. A child who drifted to sleep with visions of Thor battling frost giants was less afraid of the wind rattling the walls. An adult who remembered Odin's sacrifice for wisdom was more willing to endure hardship with patience. These stories were the mental armor of the Vikings, shielding their hearts as much as cloaks shielded their bodies. Comparisons to other peoples highlight again the uniqueness of this culture. In Slavic villages, as we have seen, the great stove was central, families gathering around its steady heat. In Celtic lands, peat fires burned slow and long, filling homes with warmth but also with heavy smoke. In Anglo-Saxon England, homes were smaller, fires central but insufficient for larger families. The Vikings, spread across harsh northern lands, created their own solution, a balance of architecture, clothing, animals, and community. They did not have the luxury of constant fire, nor the resources for endless fuel. They had each other, and that was enough. Let us imagine once again the experience of lying in a Viking longhouse on a winter night. The straw beneath is prickly but soft enough to ease the body. The cloak over you is heavy, smelling of smoke and wool, warm despite its roughness. Beside you, your family breathes steadily, their warmth seeping into your skin. Beyond them, you hear the faint shuffle of animals, the sigh of a cow, the rustle of a goat. Above, smoke curls in the rafters, catching faint light from the embers. Outside, the wind howls, snow presses against the walls, but inside there is life, fragile but steadfast.
The Vikings are often remembered for their ships, their raids, their conquests. But perhaps their greatest achievement was more humble, the ability to endure the coldest nights with nothing but straw, furs, smoke, animals, and each other. In these nights, they forged a culture of endurance, one that would carry them across seas, into new lands, into history itself. When dawn came, pale and weak, it was not just another day, it was proof of survival. Families rose, shook out straw, stretched limbs stiff from cold, fed animals, rekindled fire. They did not celebrate, for survival was expected, not extraordinary. And yet, in the quiet persistence of each morning, they revealed their strength. To endure without complaint, to continue without despair, that was the true mark of their resilience. And so, the story of the Viking Knight is not only about hardship, but about identity. To be Viking was to live with the cold, to embrace it, to shape life around it. They did not seek to banish winter, but to dwell within it, to make it part of their rhythm. This acceptance gave them strength, the strength to endure not only nights of frost, but voyages across seas, battles against foes, and challenges that would have broken weaker cultures. Thus, when we ask how the Vikings survived the coldest nights of the year without heat, the answer is layered. They survived with practical strategies: straw, furs, cloaks, smoke, animals. They survived with spiritual practices: prayers, charms, dreams, stories. And they survived with community, with families pressed close, with hospitality extended to strangers, with the unbreakable bonds of kinship. Their survival was not a miracle nor an accident, but a testament to the enduring power of human adaptation. To continue our journey into the Viking night, let us step deeper into the experience of those long winters and the many layers of meaning they held. For these nights were not only moments of endurance, but also moments of reflection, intimacy, and cultural expression. They shaped how the Vikings thought of themselves and their world, binding their daily survival to the larger rhythms of myth, nature, and time. The act of preparing for bed in a Viking household was itself a ritual. It began with practicalities: arranging straw, shaking out furs, checking embers, closing doors. Yet each action carried symbolism. Shaking the straw was not only for comfort, but a way of starting the night fresh, as though each evening renewed the promise of survival. Covering embers was not only for safety, but an act of trust, that the faint glow would carry through until morning. These gestures, repeated night after night, created continuity, a sense that even in a world of uncertainty, there were rhythms that could be trusted. In these rhythms, women's work was particularly crucial.
The weaving of wool, done in warmer months, found its true purpose at night. The thick cloaks, the woolen blankets, the carefully mended tunics, all were proofs of foresight and skill. A family wrapped in warmth at night was not only protected by nature, but by the labor of women whose spinning wheels and looms had worked tirelessly through the seasons. In this way, survival was as much about memory of labor as about the present warmth. Each thread carried the work of hands that refused to let their families freeze. Men's contributions, too, were present. The wood stacked by the hearth, the animals tethered in stalls, the meat smoked and stored, all of these represented months of preparation. When a man stirred the embers at night or checked the door against the wind, he was not only preserving the moment, but confirming the strength of his earlier labor. Survival was never the work of one gender alone, but the collaboration of all. The interplay between animals and humans in these nights reveals another layer of connection. To modern minds, the idea of sharing space with livestock might seem unpleasant, but for the Vikings, it was natural. Animals were not only labor and food, but companions in survival. Their breath warmed the air, their sounds reassured, their presence calmed. To hear a cow chewing, a goat rustling, or a dog sighing in its sleep was to know that life continued, that the household was whole. And in return, the animals were protected, valued, and woven into the story of the night as fully as any human. The spiritual significance of animals cannot be ignored. Cats, sacred to Freya, symbolized fertility and protection. Goats, linked to Thor, embodied strength. Horses carried associations of fertility and divine power. To sleep beside these creatures was to sleep in the presence of beings tied to the gods. Their warmth was not only physical, but symbolic, a reminder that the divine was close at hand, woven into daily life. Night also created space for intimacy, not only between lovers, but within families. In the quiet between first and second sleep, parents spoke to children, teaching them lessons, soothing their fears. Couples shared whispered conversations, deepening bonds. Siblings joked softly, finding lightness in the dark. These small moments of connection were not luxuries, but necessities, strengthening relationships that would carry the household through hardship. The long night became a crucible not only of survival, but of love, patience, and shared humanity. Dreams, once again, filled the silence with meaning. In Viking thought, dreams were not random. They were messages. A dream of the sea could suggest journeys ahead. A dream of wolves, danger. A dream of ancestors, reassurance. Families listened to these dreams, discussed them, and sometimes acted upon them. Dreams made the night a time of communication, not passivity. They reminded the Vikings that even in darkness, the world spoke, if only one had the ears to listen. The stories told in these nights also carried weight beyond entertainment. They were a means of preserving history. Genealogies were recited, linking children to ancestors, embedding them in a chain of belonging. Legends of past heroes were retold, not only to inspire, but to warn, to teach the consequences of choices. Myth and memory blended until the line between them blurred, creating a cultural identity as strong as iron. In this way, winter nights were classrooms, sanctuaries, and archives all at once. Hospitality again played its role. A guest in the hall became part of these rhythms, sharing straw and stories, adding warmth and perspective. Strangers brought tales from distant lands, enriching the imaginations of children and adults alike. These exchanges expanded horizons, connecting small settlements to the wider world, even in the isolation of winter. The longhouse became not only a shelter, but a meeting place of cultures, ideas, and experiences. Let us return to a vivid image of such a night. The hall lies in semi-darkness, smoke drifting lazily beneath the rafters. Families are pressed close, the warmth of bodies rising like invisible steam. Children lie between parents, their hair smelling faintly of smoke and wool. A grandmother speaks softly of Thor's battles, her words weaving images into the shadows. A dog lifts its head, ears twitching, then rests again.
Outside, the snow falls steadily, silent, relentless. Inside, the hall breathes as one, its inhabitants bound together by necessity and love. This unity was not accidental. It was forged by the cold itself, demanded by the environment. The Vikings did not survive by ignoring reality, but by adapting fully to it. They embraced closeness, smoke, animals, rituals, and stories. They accepted that survival was not an individual achievement, but a collective one. And in this acceptance, they found strength. Comparisons with other medieval cultures show the diversity of human adaptation. In Russia, families slept on or near stoves, their heat constant. In the Alps, animals were kept beneath houses, their warmth rising to human rooms above. In the Mediterranean, winters were milder, and survival did not require such closeness. The Viking method, pressing together in longhouses, relying on wool, fur, and embers, was unique to their land, their climate, their way of life. It was not inferior or superior, but perfectly suited to their reality. And so, when dawn came, pale and cold, it found families weary but alive. The cycle continued, tending animals, breaking ice for water, preparing food, gathering wood. Nights were survived not as isolated battles, but as part of a larger war, waged season after season, year after year. Each victory was quiet, uncelebrated, but vital. And in the accumulation of these victories lay the endurance of a people, the continuity of a culture, the forging of an identity. The Vikings' ability to survive without what we call heat reminds us that human beings are infinitely adaptable. We find warmth where we must, through bodies, through animals, through stories, through faith. The coldest nights, rather than breaking them, became the foundation of their resilience, the crucible from which their strength was forged. The Viking night, in its long and heavy silence, was not a time of emptiness, but of creativity and resilience. It was in these hours, wrapped in furs and cloaks, that families found their deepest strength, both physical and spiritual. And if we look closely, we see that their endurance was not only a matter of survival, but a shaping force that influenced their culture, their worldview, and their destiny. Let us begin with the architecture of longhouses once more, for they embodied more than function. They embodied philosophy. Built to endure storms, they stood low and wide, their turf roofs heavy with soil and grass, insulating against the wind. Inside, the open space meant that heat, though faint, was shared across the household. Walls were not merely barriers against cold, but boundaries of belonging, marking the space where family, animals, and spirits coexisted. To step inside from the snow was to step into a world apart, where warmth was found not in abundance, but in careful preservation. The hearth at the center was more than a fire pit. It was the axis of life, where food was cooked, light was given, warmth was spread, and stories were told. It symbolized the link between humans and gods, between earth and sky. Flames rose toward the roof, carrying smoke to the heavens, while embers glowed in the earth below. This duality, heaven and earth, light and dark, life and death, was reflected in the very experience of the night. To sleep beside the hearth was to sleep at the threshold of existence, balanced between survival and vulnerability. The smell of smoke and animals, the prickling straw,
The weight of wool, the sigh of wind outside, all combined to create a sensory world that shaped the Viking psyche. Modern comfort separates us from such sensations, but for the Vikings, they were daily companions. Their resilience grew not from escaping discomfort, but from living within it, from transforming harshness into familiarity. The cold was not a stranger, it was part of the family, ever present, demanding respect. In these nights, the role of storytelling reached its peak. We have spoken of sagas and myths, but we must emphasize how crucial they were. Stories carried warmth of their own. They reminded listeners that gods themselves fought frost giants, that even divine beings faced cold and darkness. They offered courage, laughter, and wonder, wrapping the mind in protection just as furs wrapped the body. In the flicker of firelight, shadows danced on the walls, and a tale became more than words. It became a shield for the spirit. Children were shaped profoundly by these nights. They learned patience as they lay awake, listening to stories. They learned resilience as they endured the cold. They learned faith as they whispered prayers. They learned identity as they heard genealogies and sagas, linking them to ancestors who had endured before them. By the time they reached adulthood, the cold no longer frightened them. It was part of who they were. To be Viking was to carry winter in one's soul, not as a burden, but as a badge of strength. Elders, too, found meaning in these nights. For them, survival was no longer about building muscle or gathering wood, but about preserving wisdom. They spoke of past winters, past struggles, past triumphs. Their voices linked the present to the past, assuring the younger ones that endurance was possible. Each story told by an elder was proof of life carried through decades of cold, a living reminder that survival was more than possible. It was certain if one had patience and courage. Let us not forget the role of faith. The Vikings saw the world as alive with unseen forces, spirits in forests, gods in the sky, ancestors in the earth. Night was the realm of these presences, when boundaries blurred. A creak in the rafters might be dismissed as wood, but it might also be a spirit passing. A dream might be dismissed as fancy, but it might also be a God's message. To live in this worldview was to see night as sacred, not just dangerous. Every prayer whispered, every charm placed by the bed, was part of a dialogue with the unseen, ensuring that the family was not alone in the darkness. Hospitality, again, held sacred meaning. To welcome a traveler into the longhouse at night was to share not only warmth, but fate. A guest's body added to the collective heat. A guest's stories added to the collective spirit. In return, the household gained honor, for generosity in winter was proof of strength. To refuse shelter was shameful, a betrayal of the sacred law of survival. Thus, every guest in a Viking hall became a participant in the nightly ritual of endurance, woven into the fabric of the household. Let us picture one such night with detail. A storm rages outside, snow whipping against the longhouse, the wind howling like wolves. Inside, the door creaks but holds. Families huddle close, cloaks drawn tight, furs piled high. The hearth glows faintly, embers banked beneath ash.
Children whisper about the storm, eyes wide, but a grandmother soothes them with a story of Thor's hammer breaking the power of frost giants. The dog growls softly at the wind, then curls tighter against its master's feet. The storm may rage, but inside, the household holds steady, bound together by warmth, faith, and love. Comparisons to other medieval cultures remind us how distinctive this was.
In Mediterranean lands, winters were mild, homes open, nights short. In Central Europe, stoves gave steady warmth, reducing the need for such closeness. In the Slavic north, stoves heated walls and floors, making homes warmer but less communal. The Vikings' method was unique, not superior, not inferior, but perfectly adapted to their environment. They embraced closeness, smoke, animals, and ritual because their land demanded it. And in meeting that demand, they became stronger, more united, more resilient. When dawn came, it was never triumphant. It was pale, weak, often hidden behind clouds, yet it was enough. Families rose, shook out straw, stretched limbs stiff from cold. They fed animals, rekindled fires, prepared for another day. The memory of the night lingered, but it was not seen as suffering. It was simply life. To complain would have been meaningless. To endure was expected. In this quiet acceptance lay their strength. The Vikings are often remembered for their boldness, their ships, their raids, their conquests. But perhaps their greatest boldness was more humble. To face the coldest nights without despair, without excess, relying only on the simplest of resources and the strongest of bonds. Their endurance was not dramatic, but it was profound. It was this endurance, built night after night in smoky longhouses, that gave them the strength to sail across seas, to settle new lands, to carve their place in history.
Thus, when we ask how they survived the coldest nights of the year without heat, we must see the whole picture. They survived with architecture that embraced the land, with clothing woven in foresight, with animals that shared their warmth, with rituals that guarded their spirits, with stories that guarded their minds, and with families that guarded each other. They survived not as individuals, but as communities, not through defiance of the cold, but through acceptance of it. And in this lies their true legacy, that survival is not about luxury, but about resilience, not about what we lack, but about what we share. The coldest nights, far from defeating them, became the forge that made them who they were. As we move deeper into the story of Viking knights, we begin to see that their survival was not just a set of practical tricks, but an entire worldview. The way they faced the coldest nights shaped not only their physical endurance, but also their beliefs, their values, and their relationships. Winter was not merely endured, it was integrated into the very identity of the people. One of the clearest ways this identity manifested was in the rituals of Yule. We have mentioned Yule before, but let us pause to dwell on it more deeply, for it was the centerpiece of winter life. Yule was celebrated at midwinter, when the nights were longest, when darkness seemed endless. Fires burned brighter during this festival, not because wood was suddenly abundant, but because light itself became sacred. Candles, torches, and hearths glowed as symbols of defiance, as reminders that darkness could never fully conquer. Families feasted, even if it meant depleting precious stores, for to celebrate in the darkest time was to proclaim faith in the return of the sun. At Yule, sacrifices were offered to the gods. Animals might be slaughtered, their blood sprinkled as blessing, their meat shared in communal meals. This was not waste, but an act of devotion, ensuring favor from the divine for the rest of winter. To eat heartily at Yule was to gather strength for the hardest nights yet to come. Mead flowed, songs echoed, and stories filled the hall. In these moments, the line between survival and celebration blurred, and the coldest season became not only a trial, but a time of joy, mystery, and sacred connection. Outside the longhouse, the natural world reflected this mystery. The aurora borealis, shimmering green and purple across the sky, was seen as a sign of gods moving in the heavens.
Shooting stars might be interpreted as omens, the breath of spirits passing across the night. Snow itself, glistening under the moon, seemed alive, a vast and silent presence. The Vikings did not see nature as inert, but as filled with will and spirit. Thus, to lie under cloaks at night, listening to the wind, was not only to endure weather, but to dwell in the presence of forces far greater than oneself. The sagas preserved some of this worldview. Though written centuries later, they echo with the themes of endurance, resilience, and closeness. Tales of gods battling frost giants, of heroes surviving against impossible odds, mirrored the nightly struggles of ordinary families. Myth and life reflected each other, each giving meaning to the other. A child falling asleep to a story of Thor's hammer striking ice might dream of their own strength, carrying courage into the morning. The experience of winter nights also shaped Viking social values. Hospitality, we have said, was sacred, but it was also strategic. To share warmth with strangers created bonds, alliances, debts of honor. In a world where survival often depended on others, such bonds could mean life or death. Thus, when a traveler entered a hall on a freezing night, they were welcomed not only with food and fire, but with inclusion into the very fabric of the household. This law of hospitality was woven into their legal codes and their cultural expectations, rooted in the simple truth that no one survived winter alone. Children absorbed these values through direct experience. They saw guests welcomed, food shared, blankets spread wider to include another body. They saw elders respected, their places closest to the hearth honored. They learned that survival was collective, that generosity was strength, that selfishness was weakness. These lessons, taught not in words but in nightly practice, shaped a generation ready to endure not only cold but hardship of every kind. Animals, once again, stood as silent teachers. Their warmth was immediate, their presence grounding. A child falling asleep to the sound of a cow breathing learned that survival was not only human but shared. Dogs gave loyalty, cats gave protection from pests, sheep gave wool, goats gave milk, cows gave both food and warmth. These creatures were not abstract resources, but companions in life and in the long struggle against cold. To care for them was to care for oneself, for their survival and human survival were intertwined. Let us imagine once more the atmosphere of such a night. The hall is crowded, every bench filled, every corner occupied. Straw rustles beneath bodies, furs pile high, cloaks drape across shoulders. The air is thick with smoke, warm with breath, alive with presence. Outside, the storm rages, snow whirls across fields, wind lashes against walls. Inside, the hall stands as an island of life in a sea of frost. A guest tells a tale of a distant land. Children whisper questions. Elders nod, and slowly, one by one, the household drifts into slumber. The hall breathes, sighs, and endures. Archaeology has confirmed much of this imagery. Excavations of longhouses reveal central hearths, side benches, stalls for animals. Fragments of wool, fur, and leather show the layering of clothing and bedding. Amulets, brooches, and charms testify to the presence of faith woven into daily life. These findings confirm that survival was not theoretical, but practical, embodied in objects, spaces, and habits that remain visible 1,000 years later. In comparing the Vikings to other medieval cultures, we again see their uniqueness. In southern Europe, families did not need to huddle so close, nor did they rely so heavily on wool and fur. In eastern lands, stoves provided constant warmth. The Viking way was harsher, but it created bonds that were perhaps stronger. By embracing the cold as part of life, rather than seeking to eliminate it, they created a culture defined by endurance, patience, and interdependence. The lessons of these nights still resonate. Survival is not only about technology or comfort, but about community, foresight, and resilience. The Vikings remind us that human beings can adapt to almost anything if they share the burden, if they weave together practical strategies with spiritual strength. Their legacy is not only in raids or voyages, but in these countless winter nights, endured quietly, without glory, but with profound strength. And so, when dawn came after yet another freezing night, the household did not celebrate, but simply continued. The children stretched, the animals were fed, the fire stirred, the tasks of the day resumed.
Survival was not dramatic but ordinary, and in its ordinariness lay greatness. For it was this daily endurance, repeated endlessly, that made the Vikings who they were. Thus, when we ask how they survived the coldest nights of the year without heat, the answer is simple and profound. They survived by weaving together the threads of life: food, clothing, animals, architecture, faith, stories, hospitality, and, above all, each other. Each thread alone was fragile, but together they formed a tapestry strong enough to withstand even the deepest cold. As winter nights stretched on, the Vikings lived within a cycle that was both harsh and profoundly human. Every evening repeated familiar patterns: fire tended, food shared, straw arranged, furs pulled close. Yet each night also deepened the bonds of family, faith, and endurance. To understand the depth of this experience, we must look beyond survival itself and into the meaning that survival carried. For the Vikings, survival was not merely a matter of clinging to life. It was a way of affirming their place in the cosmos. The Norse worldview saw existence as a balance between forces: light and dark, heat and cold, life and death. Winter nights were the physical manifestation of this balance. Each time a family endured another night, they felt themselves aligned with the gods who battled frost giants, with the ancestors who had endured before them. Their survival was not random. It was a reenactment of cosmic struggle, woven into myth and memory. The role of myth in these nights cannot be overstated. Consider the story of Odin, who sacrificed himself on Yggdrasil, the world tree, for wisdom. Or the tales of Thor, whose hammer shattered the power of giants born of frost and ice. These stories resonated in winter because they mirrored lived reality. To lie in a smoky hall, cold pressing at the walls, was to feel part of those battles. Children imagined themselves as small warriors, wrapped in furs like armor, while elders saw themselves as custodians of wisdom, guardians of traditions that had outlasted countless winters. The rituals of Yule, as we have discussed, embodied this worldview. Fires burned not only for warmth, but as symbols of the returning sun. Sacrifices honored gods who held sway over fertility, weather, and survival. Mead flowed, laughter rose, and the longhouse filled with song. Yet, even in celebration, practicality remained. Meat was preserved, hides were used, nothing was wasted. Yule was both sacred and practical, joy woven with necessity. Hospitality, too, found its deepest meaning in these nights. A guest welcomed into the hall became part of the family's struggle, sharing warmth and food. Stories were exchanged, strengthening ties between communities. In this way, winter created networks of mutual dependence that extended far beyond individual households. Hospitality was not optional, but a moral law, reinforced by the reality that anyone might one day find themselves in need of shelter on a freezing night. The communal sleeping arrangements reflected this ethos. Children were protected in the center, elders given respect and warmth, servants included on the edges. Animals shared space, their presence as vital as any humans. Privacy was unknown, but unity was absolute.
This unity shaped identity. To be Viking was to belong, to contribute, to endure together. Isolation meant weakness, togetherness meant survival. The longhouse itself reinforced these values. Its architecture was not designed for comfort, but for endurance. Thick walls, turf roofs, central hearths, stalls for animals, all spoke of a culture that accepted hardship and met it with ingenuity.
The building was both fortress and womb, enclosing families in a space where life could persist against the cold. To lie within its walls was to feel protected not only by wood and earth, but by the generations who had built such houses before. Archaeological evidence illuminates this vividly. Longhouses excavated in Norway, Denmark, and Iceland reveal layouts consistent with communal life. Hearths were central, benches lined the walls, and animal stalls were integrated. Artifacts, woolen fragments, brooches, bone combs, amulets speak of daily habits, blending practicality with beauty, faith, and identity. These remains are silent testimonies to the countless nights endured, to the quiet heroism of ordinary survival. The role of women, once again, was central. Their weaving, spinning, and mending created the very fabrics that kept families alive. Their cooking turned preserved stores into sustaining meals. Their stories and prayers comforted children. Their foresight and patience shaped the nightly rhythm. Men may have sailed seas and fought battles, but women held the hearth, the true axis of survival. Without their labor, the cold would have triumphed. Elders, too, had their role. Their wisdom guided decisions, their stories taught values, their endurance inspired younger generations. In the silence of the night, their voices carried authority, reminding all that survival was not new but inherited. Every elder embodied the victory of decades of winters, proof that life could outlast the cold. Children, meanwhile, absorbed these lessons unconsciously. They learned to wrap themselves in cloaks, to lie close, to listen for the sigh of wind and the shuffle of animals. They learned to interpret dreams, to respect elders, to welcome guests. By living through winter nights, they became Vikings, not in name, but in soul, inheritors of resilience forged in smoke and snow. Let us once more imagine such a night.
The hall is crowded, the air thick with smoke, the fire banked low. Families huddle close, wrapped in layers of wool and fur. Outside, the wind shrieks, rattling the walls, but inside, the sounds are softer. Breathing, the rustle of straw, the faint murmur of an elder telling a story. A child clutches a wooden amulet, whispering a prayer. A dog shifts, ears twitching, then sighs. The night presses hard, but the hall holds. Warmth, faint but real, persists. Comparisons to other cultures highlight again the uniqueness of this adaptation. In warmer lands, nights did not demand such closeness, and cultures evolved differently. In the Far East, great stoves heated homes, changing the rhythm of life. In the Mediterranean, nights were short and mild. Rituals focused more on light than heat. The Viking way was harsher, but also forged stronger communal bonds. The cold was not only an enemy, but a teacher, shaping values of unity, generosity, and endurance. When dawn finally broke, pale and weak, the household rose not with triumph, but with quiet determination. Tasks resumed, animals fed, fire stirred, food prepared. The memory of the night lingered, but it was not lamented. It was life. To endure was not exceptional, but expected, and in this expectation lay their strength. The Vikings' ability to survive the coldest nights without heat as we know it reveals something profound about humanity itself. It shows that comfort is not the foundation of survival, connection is. It shows that technology is not the only path to endurance, community is. It shows that the harshest conditions can shape not despair, but resilience, not weakness, but identity. Thus, when we remember the Vikings, let us not think only of ships and swords, of raids and conquests.
Let us remember smoky halls, straw beds, furs piled high, animals breathing warmth, stories whispered in the dark, prayers offered in silence. Let us remember that their true heroism was not only in battle, but in survival, night after night, winter after winter, in the face of a cold that never relented. As our journey through the Viking night reaches its final chapter, it becomes clear that their endurance was more than mere survival. It was a philosophy, a way of being, an unspoken covenant between humans, animals, gods, and the land itself. The coldest nights of the year, far from breaking them, forged them into the people we remember today, strong, communal, resilient, and deeply woven into the rhythm of nature. The longhouse, smoky and dim, was the crucible of this resilience. It was not only a home, but a sanctuary, a place where generations pressed together against the cold. Every stone, every beam of wood, every turf block carried meaning, for it was the vessel of survival. To sit by the hearth, to lie on straw, to share breath with family and livestock, these were not indignities, but blessings, proofs that life continued. The longhouse was both fragile and eternal, fragile against storm and snow, yet eternal in its role as the center of survival. The hearth glowed faintly at the heart of this sanctuary. Its fire was never abundant, but it was steady, a symbol of continuity. Flames might fade to embers, yet embers could always be coaxed back to life. This rhythm mirrored the Viking soul, never overwhelming, but enduring, always capable of renewal. To stir the fire at night was to affirm hope, to ensure that morning would come with warmth still alive. The presence of smoke, often seen as a nuisance in modern minds, was part of their endurance. It preserved wood, drove away insects, slowed decay, and added insulation. More than that, it was a familiar presence, the smell of home, the mark of life continuing. Children grew up breathing it, elders lived long lives despite it. It was not an enemy, but a companion, as much a part of the household as the straw on the floor or the furs on the beds. Animals completed this ecosystem of survival. Their warmth, their sounds, their breath all joined the rhythm of the hall. To lie beside a cow or a dog was not strange but natural. Their survival ensured human survival, and human care ensured theirs. This interdependence deepened the Viking sense of connection, not only to each other, but to all living beings. In winter, the line between human and animal blurred, and together they endured. Rituals filled the silence of night. Prayers whispered to Odin, Thor, or Frigg. Charms carved with runes, amulets clutched tightly by small hands. All gave reassurance that forces greater than cold were present. The Vikings did not believe themselves alone in the night. They believed gods and ancestors watched, protecting or warning, guiding or testing. A dream might be a message, a sound in the dark a sign. This worldview turned survival into sacred practice, every night a dialogue with the unseen. Stories carried this dialogue further. Sagas of gods and heroes, tales of voyages and ancestors were not entertainment alone, but armor for the spirit. They gave children courage, adults patience, elders pride. They turned fear into meaning, hardship into legacy. A storm outside was no longer just weather. It was a battle between frost giants and Thor.
A dream was no longer just fancy. It was a message from the beyond. By wrapping their nights in story, the Vikings clothed their souls as surely as wool cloaks clothed their bodies. Hospitality gave these nights social meaning. A guest welcomed into the hall was not merely sheltered. They were woven into the household's fate. Their warmth joined the collective. Their stories expanded the horizon. Their presence honored the family. Refusing shelter was dishonor, but offering it was glory, proof of strength and generosity. In this way, the coldest nights became occasions not only of survival, but of solidarity, binding communities together. Children, shaped by all this, grew into adults who carried winter within them. They learned to endure discomfort, to value closeness, to respect elders, to welcome guests, to see survival as collective. By the time they faced their own families and longhouses, they were already bearers of resilience, passing on the same lessons they had absorbed as children lying in smoky halls. Thus, survival was not improvised each winter, but inherited, taught, and renewed. Elders stood as living proof of this inheritance. Their voices carried authority because they embodied endurance. Every wrinkle was a winter survived, every story a victory over darkness. Their presence in the hall reassured the young that life could persist, that even the longest night could be outlasted. They were not burdens, but treasures, repositories of memory and resilience. And so the cycle continued, year after year, night after night. Storms raged, snow fell, cold pressed, but the longhouses held, the fires glowed, the families endured. In the repetition lay strength, for each night survived reinforced the knowledge that survival was possible. And with each dawn, pale and cold but undeniable, the household rose with quiet determination, ready to face another day.
When we look back across the centuries, it is tempting to romanticize or exaggerate, but the truth is already extraordinary. The Vikings survived the coldest nights of the year without what we call heat. They did so not with endless wood or grand technology, but with closeness, with foresight, with rituals, with stories, with faith. Their legacy is not only in raids or ships, but in this quieter, humbler heroism, repeated countless times in smoky halls across the north. Let us imagine one final night. The snow lies deep, the wind howls, the stars gleam faintly above. Inside a longhouse, families press together, wrapped in furs, cloaks, and wool. Animals shift in their stalls, their breath warming the air. Embers glow faintly, smoke drifts lazily upward. A grandmother tells a story, her voice low but steady. A child listens, eyelids heavy, clutching a wooden amulet. The hall breathes, sighs, and endures. Outside, the cold reigns, but inside, life holds. Morning will come, as it always has, as it always will. This is the true saga of the Vikings, not only battles and voyages, but nights of quiet resilience, where survival was not dramatic, but profound. They endured not by conquering winter, but by accepting it, by weaving it into their lives, by transforming hardship into identity. And in this endurance lay their greatest strength, a strength that carried them across seas, across centuries, into the heart of history. So, how did the Vikings survive the coldest nights of the year without heat? The answer, in its simplest form, is this: they survived with each other.